Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about classic horror. We're going to be talking about classic horror today. If you're a horror fan and you want to read the stuff that influenced everything else, if you want to read some classic horror, I've got some recommendations for you. I'm just going to be talking about the authors I think you should probably read if you're interested in classic horror, and the editions that you should read these authors in. These are just my recommendations. I did do a video like this once before, Roger, but this is the updated version. There have been some good books that have been published since I did this the last time. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about classic horror. What should you read? Who should you read? So let's start with Edgar Allan Poe, because you kind of have to. One of the most important horror writers of all time, if not the most important horror writer of all time. Certainly one of the most influential. And there are a lot of good choices as far as books go for Edgar Allan Poe. I probably would not start with the complete stories of Edgar Allan Poe. But there are some good volumes. This is the Bantam edition, The Telltale Heart and Other Writings. There's a Signet edition, which is very, very close to this as far as the contents are concerned. You could pretty much go with either one. Both are going to have all of the major stories that you're going to want to read if you want to read Poe, like The Fall of the House of Usher, Telltale Heart, The Black Cat, Mask of the Red Death, all that stuff. All that stuff is in here. Right? Yes, it's all in here. Plus, both this and the Signet edition both include the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. And that's pretty cool. So you can do well with either the Bantam or the Signet editions of Poe. They are probably both still in print, I think, although I'm not certain. My recommendation would be a bit different, though. I would actually recommend this book. This is the Portable Edgar Allan Poe. And I would recommend this one because it has all the major stories in it. Again, it has all the major stories. But it also has letters, it has poems. There's a lot of stuff in this book that gives you an idea of who Poe was and the different sorts of things that he would write about. So it gives you a more well-rounded view of this author. And that's why I like this particular volume. And if I was just going to pick up one volume of Poe, this would actually be the one that I would pick up. And then if you find this author particularly intriguing, you can move on. You could pick up that volume of the complete Edgar Allan Poe and read everything. But before you read everything, you can pick up this, I think. This would be my recommendation for this author. And again, tremendously important Edgar Allan Poe. And if you've never read Edgar Allan Poe, you probably should give him a try. It's excellent stuff. And speaking of a writer who is tremendously influenced by Edgar Allan Poe and is most certainly the most important horror writer of the 20th century, that would be H.P. Lovecraft, my personal favorite H.P. Lovecraft. And as far as Lovecraft goes, if you've never read Lovecraft and want to give Lovecraft a try, I would definitely go with the Penguin editions of Lovecraft, starting with this one. This is the first one that was published, The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories. This is the deluxe edition, but there is a Black Spine Classic edition of this book from Penguin. There is an Oxford edition of Lovecraft now, but it's not very good. Oxford kind of unusually dropped the ball on their Lovecraft edition. The selection isn't the best as far as reading Lovecraft for the first time. And more importantly, the texts are the uncorrected texts that are straight from Weird Tales and other pulp magazines. This edition has the corrected texts, which is what Lovecraft would approve. So in a lot of ways, the Penguin edition is just far superior. Of course, there are so many editions of Lovecraft out there right now, but I think if you've never read Lovecraft, this is probably the way to go. It's not, a massive book. It's 400 pages long, but the selection of stories is really, really good for a volume of Lovecraft. It has a lot of his major horror stories, and it also has some of his fantasy stories in here. It doesn't have, it's not a best of volume, but it does definitely give you an idea of the kinds of things that H.P. Lovecraft wrote. Lovecraft is not for everyone. And this will give you an idea if you want to continue with Lovecraft or not. Starting with this is good because Penguin also published 2 other volumes of Lovecraft to follow this up. And so if you like this, and you probably will if you're a horror fan, you could read the rest of Lovecraft's fiction, or most of it, all the important stuff, in the next 2 volumes of Penguin's Lovecraft edition. The next one is The Thing on the Doorstep and Other Weird Stories. This is the old Penguin 20th Century Classics edition. Nowadays, this is just a Black Spine Classic, this volume. Excellent. So more excellent stories from Lovecraft. And then The Dreams in the Witch House completes the Penguin set of Lovecraft. Again, excellent set of books. If you get the 3 Penguin editions, you have everything that's important, really, from Lovecraft. His horror stories, his fantasies, all that stuff. If you get the 3 volumes from Penguin, you have all of that. You have the authoritative texts. So that's what I would recommend. That is what I would get for Lovecraft. But there are so many other classic horror writers. And the next one I'm going to talk about is Algernon Blackwood. An underrated horror writer. You don't hear enough about Blackwood anymore. But there are a few good choices. Penguin has a good Algernon Blackwood volume. Ancient Sorceries and Other Strange Tales, I think is what it's called. What I would choose one of 2. Dover Books still has the best ghost stories of Algernon Blackwood available. This volume has been available for decades from Dover, and they've never changed the cover. But it's still available, I'm pretty sure, from Dover. Best ghost stories of Algernon Blackwood. And it really is. It's an excellent selection of Blackwood. Blackwood actually has an introduction to this volume. So this is definitely a good one to get, the best ghost stories. If you want a more well-rounded view of Blackwood, this is also really good. The Oxford edition is really good of Blackwood. This is fairly new. This is the Wendigo and Other Stories. The selection of stories is a bit different from the best ghost stories, but it does have the best stuff in here. It has the Wendigo. It has the Willows, has a bunch of stuff, has Ancient Sorceries. So most of the major stories are in here, but there's also some unusual things in here, some stories that have not often been reprinted. So this is an excellent volume. Again, it gives you a more well-rounded view of Blackwood and the different sorts of things that he would write. So this is a good one. Either one of these would be a good place to start with Blackwood, and I highly recommend both of them. Now, next, let's talk about Arthur Machen. Welsh writer Arthur Machen, tremendously influential again, very influential on H.P. Lovecraft. And this is the volume to get. This is the Oxford edition of The Great God Pan and Other Horror Stories. Penguin does have an edition of Arthur Machen, but it's not nearly this good. It was weird. Penguin did sort of drop the ball on their Arthur Machen collection. First of all, The Great God Pan is not included in the Penguin edition, which is inexplicable to me. How can you have an edition of Arthur Machen and not have his most important and most famous story? I don't know, but it's in here, obviously. It also has the novel, The Three Impostors, which is an episodic novel, which often in collections of Machen, they'll just take different episodes from the novel and publish those as separate short stories. This has the whole thing. This has the whole of The Three Impostors, as well as a bunch of other stuff. Definitely has all of Arthur Machen's major work. So if you've never read Machen, this is the volume to get. There's a hardcover edition of this that I used to have, but I got rid of that and just held on to the paperback. And yeah, excellent volume. The Great God Pan and Other Stories from Arthur Machen. It's good. Really good. And then there is Sheridan Le Fanu. Sheridan Le Fanu, master of the weird ghost story, very influential writer. This is Green Tea and Other Weird Stories, Oxford edition. Excellent. This is an excellent volume. It has all of the good shorter fiction from Sheridan Le Fanu. He wrote a lot. But as far as the short fiction goes, including probably his most famous story, which is Carmilla, that is available in this volume, Green Tea and Other Weird Stories. I don't know that Penguin even has a current edition of Sheridan Le Fanu. I would have to check. I'm not sure that they do. But the Oxford is excellent. So this is definitely what I would pick up. And I would pick it up because this is definitely an author you're going to want to read. Look at that creepy old cover too. That's pretty cool. And as far as ghost stories are concerned, the king of the classic ghost story is M.R. James. And this is Collected Ghost Stories. This is probably the one that I would get. Penguin has a really good 2-volume edition of M.R. James. But for the life of me, I don't know why they split it up in 2 volumes. Both volumes are kind of slim. It could have easily been 1 volume. If you want to get those 2 volumes, that's fine. But as far as just getting 1 volume of M.R. James, this is probably the one to get, the Collected Ghost Stories. This is an excellent volume from Oxford. And if you've never read this author, you really, really should. If you're interested in horror, this is great stuff. Just an excellent, excellent author, M.R. James. Every time I read him, I like him more. Great writer of ghost stories. So yeah, Collected Ghost Stories. You should read that. Now, we could talk about now the most important classic novels, including Frankenstein. This is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the 1818 text from Penguin. There are a couple different versions of Frankenstein because Mary Shelley did revise Frankenstein years later in the 1831 text, I believe it was. And that is the version you're going to find in most editions. I would actually, if you've never read Frankenstein before, I would go with the original 1818 text. Mary Shelley's original version of this story. She was a different person when she wrote this. And there are some major differences between the 2 books as far as the tone of the book feels a little different because of the changes that she made when she was older. She had a very different outlook on life when she was older. And that's reflected in her updated version of Frankenstein. I would definitely go with the original if you can. And this Penguin edition is really, really good. The Oxford edition, I don't know if the Oxford edition has the 1818 text. I think that is the 1831, if I'm remembering correctly. And there's nothing wrong with reading that version. It's still Frankenstein. It is the one that most people have read. This is the one, though. If you've never read Frankenstein, I would go with the 1818. And Penguin has a really, really good one. So there's that. As far as the biggie, Dracula, most editions of Dracula are going to be pretty much the same. Oxford, Penguin, pretty much any edition of Dracula you get, they're usually going to be the same edition. There was an edited edition of Dracula, but you don't see that reprinted that often. Usually the original version of Dracula is what's reprinted, which is definitely the one I would recommend. You have to read Dracula, of course. This is just the Penguin edition, but the Oxford edition, like I said, is just as good. Any edition of Dracula that you pick up, probably going to be pretty good. Although I would go probably with the Oxford or the Penguin myself. But as far as Bram Stoker goes, I wouldn't just stop with Dracula, because Bram Stoker's short fiction just happens to be really, really good. And Penguin has an excellent edition of his shorter stuff. Dracula's Guest and Other Weird Stories is a wonderful volume. Dracula's Guest, a volume of short stories that was out of print for a while, but fortunately, Penguin has a good edition of it, and I do highly recommend it because this short fiction was dynamite. This does include a novel. This includes The Lair of the White Worm as well, which is interesting. It's not the best book in the world. It has its issues, but it is an interesting book and certainly is different than Dracula. So I would actually move on past Dracula and read this as well. Dracula's Guest and Other Weird Stories. That's what I would recommend. And of course, we can't talk horror without talking about a couple other classics. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for example. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This also includes other stories. This is the Oxford edition. This one is excellent. And the last time I checked, Penguin's edition of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was out of print. Is that correct, Roger? The last time I couldn't find it in print, which is odd. But Oxford has a good one, so I would recommend this one. This is excellent. But I would also move on to The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. Excellent, excellent book. Now, The Phantom of the Opera was French, of course, but it suffered from some not so great translations. There's one translation, at least that I know of, that is pretty bad, which is the one you usually see reprinted. But both Penguin and Oxford have good translations of The Phantom of the Opera. I have not read the Oxford edition, although I think that's the one that was reprinted in the Folio Society. So I do have it, and I will read it one of these days. This is the Penguin, which is translated by Mireille Robert. I probably mispronounced that as usual, but yeah, definitely. This is an interesting book. It's a lot of fun, and I would definitely go with The Phantom of the Opera. You should read that as long as you're reading other classic horror books. And I would also recommend a few other things. I would look into the old Gothic stuff just because of its historical interest, like Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. This is no literary masterpiece, perhaps, but it's really, really interesting and was very influential. And this is the Oxford edition of it, which I recommend. Penguin, I think, publishes this. It might be collected with some other Gothic stuff. I don't remember. But definitely the Oxford is pretty darn good. And so I would get that. And also Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which I am due to reread. This book is something, man. You definitely got to read The Monk. Again, most editions of The Monk, I think, are pretty good. This is the Penguin edition, an older Penguin edition. It's still in print, I'm pretty sure, from Penguin. Oxford has an edition of this. Either one of those would probably be fine, but you definitely want to read The Monk. And there are a couple other things I would pick up. First, Penguin has a pretty good introductory volume of Clark Ashton Smith. This is The Dark Eidolon and Other Fantasies. So these are fantasy stories, but there's also horror in here. Clark Ashton Smith, a brilliant and underrated author, one of the big three of weird tales. If you're reading classic horror, I would definitely pick up Smith. And this actually is a pretty good place to start. I'm glad Penguin produced this volume. Oxford does not have a Clark Ashton Smith volume. Most classic publishing houses don't. But Penguin does. And this is a good place to start with this author. I definitely would read Clark Ashton Smith. And I would also pick up this. As far as I know, this is the only edition of this book. This is The Rim of Morning, Two Tales of Cosmic Horror by William Sloane. This contains two novels that were written in the 1930s, To Walk the Night and The Edge of Running Water. And yeah, the New York review of books, I think they're the only publisher that publishes this nowadays. This is excellent. It's a very different kind of cosmic horror. Very creepy. And there are some of the creepiest passages you'll ever read in these books. The first volume is better, I think. They're both good, but To Walk the Night is fantastic. And you don't hear enough about William Sloane or these books, probably because he only wrote the two of them. As far as I'm aware, those are the only two books that he wrote as far as fiction is concerned. I highly recommend it, this book. You should pick this up. And I will shut up now. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.